One of my favorite parts of the Pokemon series is the ability to transfer Pokemon from each generation to the next. This jump is not only one of the best examples of how Game Freak is able to maintain the illusion that these bits of ones and zeros are truly creatures that you've trained and grown with, but it's also a technological marvel that often showcases the unique features of each generation of Nintendo's handheld systems. However, as many fans know, not all generations were made equal. While the original Game Boy games and their sequels can trade with each other, they are not able to make the jump to the Game Boy Advance and subsequently the rest of the series. What could have been a continuous transfer chain was broken before it even had a chance. Game Freak somewhat fixed things with the re-releases of Generation 1 and 2 on the 3DS eShop, with the added ability to send your Pokemon to Pokemon Bank. But what if it were possible to bridge this gap with the original cartridges and original hardware? That was the question I was seeking to answer, and what ultimately led me to creating Poké Transporter GB. I'm not the first person to try and bridge this gap. Two very important people tried to solve this issue before me. The first was Gapier, who used a custom PCB to simultaneously communicate between the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance link cables. They were, to my knowledge, the first person to complete a trade between Generation 2 and 3 on physical hardware. However, their project has not seen an update since the spring of 2022, and schematics of their PCB were never released to the public. The next person, and the direct inspiration for this project, was Lorenzone. Their program, Gen 3 to Gen X, utilized only official hardware, and it made use of the Game Boy Advance's multi-boot function to not only run custom code, but also have access to the Generation 3 game save data. Gen 3 to Gen X was also successfully able to make a trade between Generation 1 or 2 and Generation 3, and was able to do so without any external hardware. Their program is absolutely fantastic, and I would highly recommend it. However, there were two problems that made me want to create my own solution. The first was that it was inconvenient to transfer large amounts of Pokemon. All of the other generational transfers throughout the series send Pokemon in groups and only in one direction, so that they don't lose data and to make it more convenient to transfer large groups at one time. The second problem was that Gen 3 to Gen X didn't feel official to use. One of the things that makes transferring Pokemon so exciting is the feeling that you are truly bringing your friends from one world to another, not just sending some data through a link cable. There are many solutions to sending Pokemon from Generation 1 and 2 to future games, if you're willing to dump your save file and use external programs such as PK Hex. However, this doesn't feel official and breaks the immersion of the entire Pokemon franchise. These were the two things that inspired me to want to create my own program. After discussing with Lorenzone and getting their blessing, I got to work. When I began development on Poké Transporter GB, I had no experience with creating games for the Game Boy Advance. Fortunately, there are many fantastic resources out there that I was able to utilize, such as Tonk and the GBA Dev Discord server. I was determined and excited to learn. The initial idea was simple and had three parts. The first was to trick the Game Boy Pokemon game into thinking that it was trading with another Game Boy game in order to receive the trade data. Then, I would convert that trade data into the Generation 3 Pokemon data format, and finally I would write it to the save file. Bit by bit, I was able to get the system working, and successfully was able to bridge the gap. During the process, I gained experience with SPI communication and the various data structures that Pokemon use between the three generations, as well as a handful of different checksum formulas. It was around this time that I watched a video by the YouTuber I'm a Blissey, where they used Generation 3's mystery event system to create custom DLC for Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. This immediately sparked my interest, since I could use the same system to implement my own events, where the user would pick up their Pokemon, rather than just dropping them directly into the save data. Over the next few months, I created a custom compiler where I could implement my own events on the fly, allowing me to have one setup that worked for all 12 versions of the English Generation 3 games. The base mystery event system isn't very powerful on its own though, and I was unable to send Pokemon to the PC through the normal code that Game Freak implemented their events with. This is where one of my favorite parts of the project came in: arbitrary code execution. One of the commands that you can run is call ASM, which allows you to run custom assembly code from anywhere in ROM or RAM. By writing custom assembly code within an unused section of the save data, specifically section 30, we can quite literally do whatever we want in the game. This is how I was able to create a mystery event that would take up to 30 Pokemon stored in the save section 30 and place them in the user's PC. Months later, after getting the chance to talk to Blissey themselves, we were able to figure out how to add custom graphics and custom sound. Ultimately, I was able to add in a custom event that really felt unique and truly felt like something that Game Freak would have implemented themselves back in 2002. At this point, things felt pretty polished on the Generation 3 side of things, but there was one issue that was really bothering me. Since the Pokemon data was being sent through a link cable trade, the Pokemon themselves were not removed from the Game Boy games and were effectively cloned into Generation 3. Initially, I explained this with story reasons, saying that the Pokemon that made their way into Generation 3 were simply Ditto that were really good at staying transformed. This works fine, but I knew that I wanted to figure out some way of truly transferring Pokemon out of Generation 1 and 2. It was then that I remembered a video by Mr. Cheese, where they created a virus for Generation 1 that was spread by trading. After researching it a bit more, I learned that the catalyst for this was an arbitrary code execution exploit through the link cable, more specifically known as remote code execution. If I could figure out how this exploit worked, I could use it to truly do anything that I wanted on the Game Boy side of things. This exploit was specifically for Pokemon Red and Blue, but I needed to figure out if it was possible in Yellow, as well as Gold, Silver, and Crystal, and not to mention the other languages of the games as well. The exploit works thanks to an oversight that there is no limit to the number of Pokemon that can be in the trainer's party and sent over the link cable, which allows you to overwrite the stack. Due to the differences between Yellow and Red and Blue, the exploit was possible, but it wasn't as clean, since Yellow doesn't have a glitch Pokemon with a blank name. Gold, Silver, and Crystal were initially scary because they, at first glance, fixed the exploit that Generation 1 made use of. The game would automatically stop writing Pokemon names to the screen if the number of Pokemon in the party was larger than 6. However, Generation 2 had an exploit that Generation 1 didn't. There was no limit on how long a trainer name could be. This actually made the exploit far easier to pull off, since I had direct control over the trainer nickname, rather than relying on Pokemon names stored within the ROM. I also used a Python script in a library called Gen1utils to check all of the other languages, and in one way or another it was possible in each and every one of them. In order to make things easier in the long run, I wrote a function into my code that would automatically calculate what the party list and names would need to be in order to overwrite the stack successfully. I also added another custom compiler, this time for Z80 assembly, so that I could modify the code slightly depending on which game the program was communicating with. It was now possible to completely take over the code that the Game Boy was running, and subsequently send over the entire current box and remove them from the source game as well. Functionally, everything was shaping up, but then I got a message on Twitter that caused me to realize that I was indeed missing something. LJ Birdman had seen my program and was inspired to create custom graphics for it. Myself, not being an artist, gladly accepted. Over the next few weeks, we worked together on making everything look polished and clean, truly like something Game Freak would have created. Throughout this process, I gained knowledge on so many things that I didn't even begin to imagine when this project began back in March of 2023. I've researched, reverse engineered, and developed for SPI communication, data structures, graphic implementation, ARM7 and Z80 assembly code, arbitrary code execution, and the stack. I also learned about how to overwrite the stack for arbitrary code execution entry points. I gained experience in understanding functions through decompiled source code. I've discovered how to debug large programs effectively and efficiently. I got to work with others, and most importantly, I got to see a project through to the end. Not that this is truly the end, far from it. I still have many ideas that I want to implement for Poké Transporter GB, including making the multi-boot upload process far more accessible. Of all the projects that I've worked on, this is truly the first one that I feel has met the expectations that I started with, and even exceeded them. I can't wait for everyone to be able to feel the same sort of excitement that I felt when I successfully sent the first Pokemon from Generation 1 to Generation 3, and subsequently brought them all the way up to the current titles, Scarlet and Violet, finally adding the original releases of Generation 1 and Generation 2 to the transfer chain. I want to thank a handful of people for their help on this project. First, I have to thank Lorenzo for not only being the inspiration for this project, but assisting me multiple times throughout the process. They've been extremely kind and helpful, and I cannot thank them enough. Their video on Generation 3 to Generation X will be linked in the description. Secondly, I'd like to thank I'm a Blissey. Not only did they inspire me to add the mystery event aspect to this program, but they were a fantastic resource to chat with and to bounce ideas off of, as well as very kind and supportive of the project. Their video on Ruby and Sapphire DLC will also be linked in the description. Next, I want to thank my friend Joan. They were one of the first people who I worked with on developing this program, and countless hours have been spent between the two of us coming up with ideas. This project truly would not have been the same without them. I'd also like to thank LJ Birdman for reaching out to me about graphics. Their artistic touch is really what brings this project to life, and without them, it simply wouldn't feel as official as it does. They were also the one to show me the fantastic custom Gen 2 icon sprites that were created by Luigi TKO, GUI Able, Sour Apple, and the various artists from Pokemon Showdown and Pokemon Crystal Clear. I'd also like to thank Timo VM and Mr. Cheese as well. They were both extremely helpful in figuring out the remote code execution exploits that ultimately led to the final result. Timo VM did research into cleaner remote code execution entry points for Yellow, which will end up replacing the messy Yellow entry point at sometime in the near future. A link to both of their channels will be in the description as well. I'd also like to thank my friends N, Roku, Sleepy, Eza, Serotonin, Basabi, Mad, and everyone else who has listened to me talk about this project for over a year. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone in the technical Pokemon community. I've been watching so many of you make discoveries and finish projects over the years, and you all have directly inspired me to create this program. If anybody watching this is interested in being a part of the technical Pokemon community, my best advice for you is to just jump in. Be inspired. Be excited to learn. You truly never know what you're capable of until you make the leap and just go for it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy Poké Transporter GB.